Okay, who is the Artist-Economist?
Well, the Artist-Economist is the development really of this of my identity. I had a long career as an economist for 25 years, and then in the last 6 years I've become an artist. And as I had experiences as an artist, I realised that these were changing the way in which I viewed economic theory, and so that's when I kind of grew into the identity of the artist-economist, an economist who's had certain experiences with art that kind of have changed my view of economic theory.
So would you say you're an economist who likes art?
I was already an economist that liked art, but I would say that I'd fallen kind of short of having a real art experience, a real creative experience. I kind of was a consumer of art, a passive consumer. I never saw myself as a creator, as a maker, and so I was a very kind of logical, kind of spreadsheet, legal, straight line kind of economist that didn't really think outside of kind of classification and coding systems, and so it was a very different experience. Although I enjoyed looking at art, it was a very different experience than actually becoming an artist, where I did start to create things, where I became aware of a kind of much more fluid, much less linear way of thinking and being that allowed me to kind of become aware of this new identity.
Noticing that in the title you call yourself the Artist-Economist, and artist comes before the word economist, and seeing that you were an economist, was there some transformation or awakening that came about that led to this?
Yes, I think very much. I mean, obviously I've had a 25 plus year career as an economist, and so, you know, as in life we adopt these kind of identities, or we assume these identities, and so I have a very strong identity as an economist. But I think that 6 years ago, when I started making art, that identity started to evolve. But I think it's very important that it is that way around, the artist-economist. I don't think it's economist-artist, because I think the point is that becoming an artist and the experience of being an artist actually changed the way in which I see economics, changed the way in which I kind of changed the assumptions that underlie my views on economic theory. So actually that kind of artist prefix is very important, artist-economist. And I actually am a great believer in the fact that, you know, whatever your career, whatever your specialization, whatever your expertise, if you then went and studied art, that actually the knowledge that you would have, the experience that you would have, would deepen as a result of, of your specialist subject, would deepen as a result of your experience as an artist. So I think actually, you know, the artist prefix is a very important concept. It's a very important way of kind of gaining knowledge that isn't necessarily available from books. I do feel that I understand more as the artist-economist from having this experience as an artist, which wasn't gained from books or kind of logic, than I had as an economist, which was based on kind of studying existing knowledge and existing data. So yes, the way round that is very important. Artist-economist.
Okay, what is the new economics?
So the new economics really is, or in fact what I call immaterial equilibrium economics, is an attempt to kind of reflect the new assumptions that that I'm working with as an economist now, because conventional economic theory, and indeed most economists, work from the assumption that there are a finite amount of resources, that the supply of resources is finite, and that demand is unlimited, and that the market mechanism will adjust price to ensure that demand equals supply and the market will be in equilibrium. My experience with infinity has been, as an artist, has been very real. You know, as an artist, I try and work with infinite space as a media to make art, and I've had some experiences with infinity and infinite space that convinced me that infinity is real. And then once I realised that, I went back to economic theory, and you know, the starting point in economic theory is that, you know, that resources are finite, and that, you know, the basic problem of economics is how to allocate finite resources. And actually, if resources are not finite and there is an infinity, an abundance in the universe that I can have access to, then it completely changes what economics is about, because economics no longer can be about how to allocate scarce resources. Indeed, it kind of questions the whole concept of demand, because when I've experienced infinity as an artist, I've had such a sense of well-being, such a sense of kind of satisfaction, of being kind of perfectly content, you know, really not needing anything, really aware that I have everything that I need to be happy. And the idea of demand just doesn't make sense. And so the new economics, immaterial equilibrium economics, is about infinite supply and the end of demand, and it completely changes economic theory.
So with your experiences with art, making art, in becoming an artist, in understanding what art means, could you describe perhaps one of these experiences that maybe help explain an experiences you say you've had with infinity?
And when I started out as an artist, I was fascinated by space. You know, when I looked at any object, you know, if I looked at a chair, I was really interested in the space underneath the chair. You know, and I was fascinated by, you know, work by Bruce Nauman and Rachel Whiteread that, you know, really explored those spaces by kind of making sculptures out of those spaces. And so I decided that I wanted to work with space as an artist myself. But of course the problem with working with space is that space is actually infinite. And there is no, you know, any border that we make around space is actually, you know, an arbitrary one. And so as I worked with space, I started having the real sensation that actually space was infinite. Now there's a few ways in which I've come to kind of be able to demonstrate infinity. One of them is the kind of reducing cube, where if I define a cube space, say in front of me, between me and the camera, and I define this cube space like this, and so this is a real space that exists, probably about 20 centimetres by 20 centimetres. Now if I was to picture that cube halving in size, and halving in size again, and again, and again, and again, and again, it would eventually keep going smaller, but it would never reach zero, that mathematical paradox that it never reaches zero, and probably somewhere around this point would be a point at which the cube would keep going infinitely small, but never get to zero. And I very much like that kind of framing of one point of infinity, because in reality there's an infinite number of points of infinity in this space. But by framing one point, I can touch it, I can put my head into it, I can put my body into it if I wanted to, I can put my hand into it, and I can have a sensation of infinity. So that's kind of one demonstration, and I sometimes do large-scale demonstrations where I make a 2-meter cube and I stand inside it and can experience infinity that way. Another experience of infinity is walking in a circle, and I've tried experiments with that where I'm walking in a circle, and I was kind of inspired by Robert Smithson when he talks about the horizon as being never actually reaching the horizon, but always being on the horizon, and this concept of being there and here at the same time. And I was really fascinated by that, and I kind of have imagined walking around the world. So when I imagined walking around the world, that if I was to set off from here and start walking, say in a westerly direction, and to keep walking around the world, assuming that I could cross the sea, then I would always be walking towards the horizon. It would appear to me as if I was on a flat surface walking towards the horizon. I would never reach the horizon, but eventually I would come back to this point. I would come back to the point where I started, and I really like that idea that actually when I walk in a circle, so I've done some performances where I've just been walking in a circle and talking as I walked about the experience, and there's a real sense of infinity in that, because once you start walking in a circle, there is no start and there is no end. There is no end to walking in a circle. It just keeps going. And when I engage in these experiences, I feel that I understand infinity, and not only understand, that I really kind of live and experience infinity in a way that is quite difficult to do just when you're thinking about infinity conceptually.
So coming back to the question of this new economics, is this economic theory born out of artistic experience?
Yeah, very, very much so. I think that, as an economist, before I was an artist, my approach to economics, my kind of methodology was much narrower. In the name of kind of science, my methodology was quite narrow and restricted. And I think, becoming an artist, I actually allowed myself, in terms of my artistic practice, I allowed myself to have a much unlimited methodology, where non-linear, non-logical, really allowing the creative energy to take me in any direction in a way that I'd never really worked as an economist. I think, as an economist, I always worked with logic and very, very kind of ordered and structured arguments, and I was good at that. But as an artist, the experience is very different in terms of just opening up a whole new way of looking at things and approaching things, and not kind of looking at things just from one angle. And so the experience of being an artist, then coming back to economics and approaching economics in a more open way, has actually been quite a revelation. I think it's kind of opened up that narrow way in which I looked at economics previously. And I think the truth is that actually there was a point when I realised that I really was an artist. When I started making art 6 years ago, there was a point several years into that where I realised that I really was an artist, and I thought that I'd left my old identity as an economist behind. But actually, it was as I went on with my experiences as an artist that I've realised that there was a kind of politics in what I was discovering in terms of infinity and my experiences of infinity, and that when I stopped to think about it, that actually fed back into my economics, and that actually I still had something to say as an economist. And so the idea of the Artist-Economist now feels like a mission almost to kind of update economic theory, to take into account this dramatic kind of reality.
Okay, yeah, so the next question is, how does this differ from conventional economics?
Well, conventional economic theory is based on the idea of finiteness. I mean, a textbook definition of economics is that economics is the study of how finite resources should be allocated, or it's the social science of how finite resources should be allocated. And where the new economics really changes things is that it challenges that, or rejects that assumption of finiteness, because actually if the immaterial really exists, finiteness is a material concept. The immaterial is a much more, although it's intangible, it's the immaterial is real, and the immaterial is infinite. And so once one's had the experience of infinity, the real experience of infinity, the idea of finiteness just no longer has any relevance. And so an economic theory based on finiteness would seem to be fundamentally flawed, and certainly I'm very dissatisfied with that as an economic theory, because there is the implications of conventional economic theory are that there's a limited amount to go around, and I need to grab what I can and I need to guard it, and I need to kind of work really hard for myself. Whereas in truth, if actually abundance exists, if there really is something infinite inside of me, and it feels like I've experienced infinity inside of me, then grabbing things just doesn't make sense. Protecting things just doesn't make sense. And in fact, the flow maybe should go the other way. That if I feel that I'm accessing something infinite, if I give it away, then possibly I kind of turn the tap on more of it. I get more. And so really there's a kind of fundamental conflict between the new economics, immaterial equilibrium economics, and conventional economic theory.
You can't help but want to ask this question at this point about quite an obvious, and I want to use the word dichotomy. I'm not entirely sure if I'm using it the correct way, but how people's opinions, perceptions, responses, passions are split when it comes to the art world and the cost of art. What you're doing, and whether you have anything to say on this, in the price of art, how much it goes for, and the real value of art, how it uses art. Are you saying anything about this?
Yes, I think as the Artist-Economist I've got very strong views on the art market, because any market attempts to impose a kind of order, a framing, a commoditization of the product for sale, and I think that actually for me art is actually concerned with the immaterial. Art's concerned with something much bigger than a product which can be bought and sold. And for me, art and creativity are as much a part being a human being, the experience of living, as breathing, as eating, as having sex. And so the idea of having a market and demand and supply and a finite amount of art for sale at a certain price, depending on how much demand there is, just is, for me, is a very kind of distorted view of art. Now, I don't criticise artists for trying to make a living like anyone else, like people working in a coffee shop or in a bank or a shop, but so artists have a right to make a living, but actually at one level, to make a market out of art is just absurd. And so I think, immaterial equilibrium economics is actually making quite a strong statement about capitalism and about markets, that the concept of a market in the presence of infinity does not make sense. A market requires valuing and selling and by definition finiteness and often fear that I won't be able to get what I want, or fear that I won't get the price for what I want, that actually it takes us away from what art is really about, which is ultimately, for me, being an artist is about experiencing the immaterial, and ultimately experiencing infinite space.
So is your art for sale?
That's a really good question. I mean, obviously, I live in a society where, we have to have a certain amount of money in order to live. We have to pay rent and buy food, and so, obviously, I, like anyone else, I have to earn a living. So if I work full time as an artist, I need to have some form of income from that. But that said, it doesn't sit right with me, the idea of my work being for sale, because actually my work is the immaterial. I can't sell infinity by definition. There has to be a finiteness to put something on sale. So, that sounds like a contradiction, and it is. But I feel strongly about that. So no, really, my work can't be sold.